The first thing I noticed wasn't the tractor at all. It was the silence around it. Not the ordinary quiet of an empty field, but the particular hush that settles over a machine everybody has already given up on. Men in this county don't waste words on lost causes. They just stop mentioning them. And when I asked about the old International sitting behind that collapsed hay barn, 3 different old-timers at the feed store gave me the exact same look before they gave me the exact same answer. She's gone, Han, has been for 20 years. Save your money for something that'll actually run. I've heard that sentence before. In one form or another, I've heard it my whole life, usually from men who never once got their hands dirty enough to know the difference between gone and merely waiting. So I drove out to that farm on a gray Tuesday morning with a thermos of coffee, a tow chain, and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't listen to feed store wisdom, and I stood in front of her for the first time. She was worse than I expected, and somehow still exactly what I'd hoped for. 20-some years under open sky does things to a machine that words can only half describe. The paint, once a proud international red, had gone the color of dried blood in some places and vanished down to bare, freckled steel in others. Wasp nests, papery and abandoned, clung to the underside of the fender like old scar tissue that never quite healed right. The rear tires had sunk into the earth so deep that grass had grown up through the tread, stitching the machine to the ground, as if the soil itself had decided she belonged to it now, not to anyone with keys. A family of field mice had clearly called the engine compartment home for at least 2 winters, and evidence of their tenancy was everywhere. Chewed insulation, a nest of corn husks tucked into the air cleaner housing, the kind of smell that tells you nature has been quietly rewriting the machine's history while nobody was watching. But here's what those feed store men never bothered to notice, because they were too busy deciding she was finished. Underneath all of it, underneath the rust blooming like orange lichen across every exposed bolt head, underneath the crumbling seat cushion and the cracked steering wheel and the sun-bleached decals that could barely still spell out her model number, there was a frame that hadn't bent. A block that hadn't cracked. And when I climbed up to check, a fuel tank that some careful hand decades ago had drained dry before walking away for the last time. That single detail told me more than any of the men at the feed store ever could. Whoever parked this tractor here hadn't abandoned her in anger or neglect. They had put her to sleep, gently, the way you tuck a blanket around something you intend to come back for. They just never did. I bought her for $400 and the promise that I'd haul her off the property myself, which suited the elderly farmer just fine. He didn't come out to watch the loading. His daughter told me, quietly, on the porch, that her father hadn't looked at tractor directly in longer than she could remember. There's a particular kind of grief men carry for machines, and it looks almost exactly like indifference from the outside. It isn't. I know that look. I've worn it myself. It took 2 men, a tow strap, and 45 minutes of cursing to get her onto the trailer, her seized front axle shrieking in protest the entire way, a sound like something waking from the deepest part of a long, cold sleep and resenting every second of it. By the time I backed her into my shop that evening, the light was fading to that particular bruised purple that only happens in late autumn, and I stood there in the doorway for a long moment just looking at her silhouette, engine cold, wheels crooked, paint peeling like sunburned skin. Somewhere behind that rust-caked grill was either a heart that could beat again, or a block full of nothing but corrosion and false hope. There was only one way to find out, and it wasn't going to be fast, and it wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wasn't going to be cheap in the ordinary sense. But I've never once done this work for the ordinary reasons. Money was never really the currency I traded in, not with machines like her. I budgeted this restoration the way I budget every one. A little at a time, a part here when I could afford it, a tool borrowed there when I couldn't, doing with my own 2 hands what a shop across town would have charged a small fortune to do with a machine and a bored teenager watching a screen instead of watching the work. That's the old way, the way most folks reading this still remember and still respect, even if the world around them has mostly forgotten it. You don't need deep pockets to bring something back from the edge. You need time, and you need to be willing to skin your knuckles more times than you can count. And you need to care more about the outcome than about how many hours it costs you on a clock nobody's paying you to watch. I've never once regretted the hours. I've only ever regretted the times I didn't take enough of them. The next morning I started where every honest resurrection has to start. Not with the engine, not yet, but with listening. I ran my palm along the block, feeling for the ghost of every repair some forgotten mechanic had made decades before I ever touched her. A weld here, rough and confident, done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. A replaced bolt there, mismatched, done in a hurry, maybe during harvest season when there wasn't time to drive into town for the right size. Every scar on a machine like this is a sentence in a story nobody wrote down, and my job, before I could even think about turning a key, was to read every single one of them. The fuel system told me the saddest part of the story first. I cracked open the tank and found it dry as old bone, exactly as I'd suspected. But the lines themselves had been left full, and 20 years of stagnant diesel had turned to a thick, tar-like sludge, the color and consistency of cold molasses left in a jar too long. The smell hit me before I even got the fitting loose. That unmistakable, oddly sweet reek of diesel gone bad, oxidized and thickened, mixing with old rubber and rust into something that clung to the back of my throat for the rest of the afternoon. I've come to almost love that smell, if I'm honest. It's the smell of a machine that tried to hold on to its purpose long after everyone stopped believing it would matter. I pulled the injector pump next, and that's when I understood exactly why the local men had written her off so quickly. Diesel engines don't forgive neglect the way gasoline engines sometimes do. A gas engine might sit for years and still cough to life with enough coaxing. A diesel needs precision, needs its injector pump timed just so, needs compression tight enough to ignite fuel through heat alone, no spark plug to cheat with, no shortcuts available. If moisture had gotten into that pump, if the internal components had seized or corroded, there would be no reviving her with elbow grease and good intentions. There would only be an expensive rebuild or an even more expensive replacement, and either one would turn this whole project from a resurrection into a very costly funeral. I set the pump aside on my workbench, wrapped it in a shop towel like something fragile, and made myself wait a full day before I opened it up. Some mysteries deserve to be approached slowly. You don't rush the answer to a question you've been afraid to ask. When I finally did crack the housing the next evening under the dim yellow glow of my shop light, my hands were steadier than my nerves had any right to be. Inside, the internals were dry, not seized, not rusted through, just dry and stiff with coated in old varnish where the diesel had evaporated and left its residue behind like a chemical fossil. Dry is fixable. Dry means patient soaking, careful cleaning, gentle persuasion instead of brute force. Seized would have meant surrender. Dry meant hope, and hope in this line of work is worth more than any part you can order from a catalog. That's when I found it. Tucked into a small recess behind the pump housing, wedged so precisely into a gap that it could not have fallen there by accident, was a folded scrap of paper, brittle and yellowed, protected from the elements by nothing more than the tight metal seal of the housing itself. My fingers went still. 20 years that pump had sat exposed to weather and vermin and time, and whatever was tucked inside it had been waiting, patient as the tractor herself, for someone curious enough, or foolish enough, depending on who you asked, to take that pump apart instead of simply replacing it wholesale. I want you to understand something about restoration work before I tell you what that paper said, because it matters to the story. Most people, when a part looks bad enough, simply throw it away and bolt on something new. It's faster. It's often cheaper in terms of hours, if not always dollars. But something new has no story in it. Something new hasn't survived anything yet. I have built my entire life's work around the stubborn belief that the old part, the tired part, the part everyone else would toss in the scrap bin, usually has more truth left inside it than the shiny replacement ever will. That belief is exactly why I hadn't thrown that pump away, and it's exactly why I found what I found. The handwriting on that scrap of paper was a woman's, small and careful, the kind of penmanship taught in one-room schoolhouses 2 generations back. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but it was still legible enough if I held it at just the right angle under the light. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't even really a note in the way you'd expect. It was a list, dates mostly, and short phrases beside them. Oil changed, points gapped, ran rough, adjusted mixture, better now. The kind of maintenance log a careful owner keeps in their head or on a calendar, except this one had been kept on a scrap of paper folded small enough to hide inside a fuel pump, as though the person writing it needed somewhere safe to put down proof of her own competence. The last entry, dated some 22 years back, in that same careful hand, read simply, "Drained her dry today. Rest now, old girl. I'll be back for you when things settle." I sat on the cold concrete floor of my shop for longer than I cared to admit, that brittle scrap of paper resting in my palm, piecing together a story nobody had told me, and nobody, it seemed, had ever intended for me to find. The farmer's daughter, when I called her the next morning and gently asked, went quiet on the other end of the line for a moment before she told me what I'd already half suspected. That tractor hadn't belonged to her father at all. Not really, not in the way that mattered. It had belonged to her mother, who had run that farm's fieldwork herself for nearly 15 years while her husband worked construction jobs 3 counties over to keep them afloat during the lean seasons. Her mother had learned to gap her own points and time her own injector pump because there wasn't money to pay a mechanic and there wasn't a husband home enough of the year to ask. And when her mother passed unexpectedly, in the season before that final drained dry entry, her father simply couldn't bring himself to touch the machine his wife had loved and understood far better than he ever had. So he parked her. He drained her. And then, for over 20 years, he let the county believe she was simply worn out and forgotten, because that story was easier to tell than the true one. I understood then why every man at the feed store had been so quick to write her off. It's a particular kind of avoidance, dressed up as practicality. Easier to call a machine dead than to explain why you can't bear to look at her. That knowledge changed everything about how I worked from that point forward. This wasn't just an old International anymore, a rusted hulk behind a collapsed barn worth $400 and a strong back. This was another woman's hands, decades removed from mine, reaching forward through rust and time and diesel sludge to hand me something unfinished. I intended to finish it. I rebuilt that injector pump the way you'd set a broken bone. Carefully, patiently, checking my work twice for every once I trusted it. New seals where the old ones had turned brittle and cracked. A careful flush of every internal passage with fresh solvent until the varnish and grime ran clear. I hand-lapped the plunger where wear had left it just barely out of spec, working by feel more than by gauge in the end, the way the woman who'd left that note surely had, decades before torque wrenches and specification charts had ever crossed her kitchen table. The block itself needed less mercy than I'd feared, and more patience than I'd hoped. I pulled the head to check the cylinders and found them scored, but not catastrophically so, the kind of wear that comes from honest decades of work rather than the kind of damage that comes from real neglect. I honed each cylinder by hand, feeling the crosshatch pattern emerge again beneath the stone like something being remembered rather than created. New rings, new gaskets. Cut and fitted myself where the modern replacement parts didn't quite match her older, oddball specifications, because a machine built before standardization doesn't always cooperate with a parts catalog built decades after her, and you learn to make peace with that, and sometimes you learn to make the part yourself. The electrical system was its own particular battle. Wires brittle as dried grass, insulation crumbling to dust between my fingers the moment I touched it. A wiring harness that had to be rebuilt almost entirely from scratch using nothing but the original routing as my guide, tracing each burned and broken strand back to its source, like following a very slow, very stubborn river back to where it began. The hydraulics gave me the longest fight of all. Old seals don't fail quietly. They weep first, then leak, then finally surrender altogether. And hers had done all three over the course of 2 decades, sitting exposed to freeze and thaw, season after season, until the lift cylinder was little more than a hollow tube with a memory of pressure it no longer knew how to hold. I sourced what seal kits I could from a supplier 3 states away who still stocked parts for machines this old. And where I couldn't find the right size, I learned to cut my own gaskets from sheet material on my kitchen table at night, tracing patterns by hand under a desk lamp long after the shop had gone dark and cold around me. There is a particular kind of tired that comes from that work, a bone-deep weariness that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with care, and I wore it most evenings that winter like a second coat I never bothered to take off. The drawbar had rusted solid to its mounting pin, and freeing it took a full afternoon of penetrating oil, patient heat from a torch held just far enough away to coax the metal without scorching the paint I'd already touched up nearby, and a breaker bar long enough that I had to brace my whole body against the fender just to keep my footing when it finally, suddenly, let go. That's the part nobody tells you about this work when they see the finished photographs. For every triumphant moment, there are a dozen quiet, grinding hours that never make it into any story. Hours spent on your back on cold concrete with rust flaking down into your eyes. Hours spent simply staring at a stuck fitting and willing it, through sheer stubbornness, to eventually cooperate. Weeks passed, then a month, then 2. My hands learned every inch of her the way you learn the geography of an old friend's face. The particular curve where a fender had been dented and hammered back into rough shape by someone without a body shop's precision, the small drilled hole in the dash where a gauge had once lived and never been replaced, the initials scratched faintly into the underside of the seat bracket, where no one would ever think to look unless they were lying on the shop floor exactly as I happened to be one Tuesday afternoon, replacing a hydraulic line. The initials matched the handwriting on that folded scrap of paper. She had marked this machine as hers in the one place she knew her husband would never find it, and never understand it even if he had. By late winter, she was as close to whole as 20 years of silence and one careful season of work could make her. New fuel lines, clean and bright against her weathered frame. A rebuilt pump, timed and tested on my bench until I trusted it, the way you trust a promise you've kept to yourself in private. Fresh oil, the good kind, poured slow into a crankcase that hadn't known lubrication in longer than some of my neighbors had been alive. Compression tested and holding steady, cylinder by cylinder, numbers that told me what my hands had already started to believe. The morning I finally turned the key, I made sure I was alone, not because I doubted myself, but because some moments deserve privacy, the way a held breath deserves silence around it. I primed the fuel system by hand, feeling resistance give way to the particular firmness of a system finally free of air, finally trusting itself to carry fuel the way it was built to. I cycled the glow plugs, watching the little indicator dim slow amber to nothing, counting the seconds the way you'd count them before blowing out a candle you weren't sure would relight. And then I turned the key the rest of the way. She cranked hard, slow, reluctant, the sound of old iron waking from something deeper than sleep. A groan that came up from somewhere in her chest that had nothing to do with mechanics and everything to do with memory. I held my breath, the starter strained, and then, on the third long pull, something caught, a rough, uneven cough of combustion, diesel finally meeting compression, finally meeting decades of patient waiting, and she fired. Not smooth, not gentle. She fired rough and loud and trembling, gray smoke pouring from her stack, thick enough to make my eyes water, the whole frame shaking beneath me like something remembering, all at once, exactly what it felt like to be alive and useful and needed. I sat there with both hands still on the wheel, tears cutting clean tracks through 20 years of shop dust on my face, listening to that engine settle, cylinder by cylinder, into a steady, uneven, absolutely glorious rhythm. She wasn't perfect. She idled a touch rough even after I'd done everything right. The particular imperfection of an old heart that has simply seen too much to ever run silent again. But she was running. After 22 years of silence, after every man in 3 counties had quietly agreed she was gone for good, she was running, loud and unashamed, in a shop that smelled of fresh diesel and hot metal and something that felt, unmistakably, like vindication. I drove out to that farm the following weekend, the tractor rumbling steady beneath me the whole way there, and I found the old farmer sitting on his porch exactly where his daughter said he'd be. I didn't say anything at first. I just pulled into the yard and let the engine idle. Let that sound roll across the property the way it must have decades ago, on ordinary mornings nobody thought to treasure at the time. He came down off that porch slower than I expected, one hand on the rail the whole way, and he stood in front of her for a long, long moment without speaking. Then he reached out and laid his palm flat against her hood, right where the paint had worn thin from another hand doing exactly the same thing, decades before either of us ever stood in that yard. He didn't say much. Men like that rarely do. But he asked me, quiet, almost like he was afraid of the answer, whether I'd found anything when I took her apart. And when I handed him that small, folded scrap of paper, brittle and careful and 20-some years patient, I watched a man who hadn't looked directly at that tractor in over 2 decades finally let himself look. The men at the feed store were wrong, in the end, the way men often are when they mistake silence for surrender. She hadn't been gone. She'd simply been waiting for someone patient enough and stubborn enough, and willing enough to believe that a machine put to sleep with that much care was never meant to stay asleep forever. Every rusted bolt I fought loose, every dried gasket I replaced, every hour I spent tracing brittle wire back to its source, all of it was just the long, slow work of proving that some things left behind aren't abandoned at all. They're simply waiting for the right hands to come along and finish what love started.